Hey everybody, Elizabeth Nader back with you, the Nader Narrative on Jersey First TV. Today we are talking about the administrative state. Now, that may sound boring to you, but it's not. Trust me, it's affected your world, and we're going to talk about how it's affected some specific things in New Jersey. But since the 1980s, there was a decision made that has allowed the regulatory agencies in Washington, D.C. to grow in power. And you've heard this, you hear the term deep state and other things, but the reality is that we as Americans, we vote to put congressmen and women, senators in to make laws, right? To make laws on our behalf. And we expect them to do what we want them to do, or we vote them out. But what happens when those that are not voted in, those that are not elected officials, begin to make rules and regulations that effectively become like laws? What does that do to our daily lives? What does that do to businesses? How does that impact us? And what's happened recently with the Supreme Court that's really honestly an exciting change and some relief from the growth of the administrative state. So I'm really happy to bring somebody who knows this thing backwards and forwards and was part of really this amazing decision in the Supreme Court. Ryan Mulvey, welcome to the show. We're so glad to have you here.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
So everybody, Ryan's background, an attorney, a policy counsel at Americans for Prosperity Foundation since 2019. We work closely at Jersey First with Americans for Prosperity. But Ryan, your background really is in policy, not only the law, but policy, politics, all of it. How did you get to the point where you were fighting on behalf of the American people to try to reduce the administrative state? Give us a little background.
Yeah, of course. I'm happy to do that. So in addition to my role at Americans for Prosperity Foundation, I'm an attorney at a group called Cause of Action Institute, which works with AFP and AFP Foundation. And we have been fighting for fishermen and against overregulation and the sort of administrative state for years, and for fishing for 10 years. We had a case in the groundfish fishery in New England where we challenged industry-funded monitoring, the same sort of rule in Loper Bright that we're fighting now. And, not just in that case, but generally fighting instances where government is getting in the way of people trying to make a living and to live their lives. And Chevron Deference has until recently been a big part of how the administrative state has come to really govern our lives in a way that the laws passed by Congress don't.
Well, let's talk about Chevron deference, because we use a lot of terms to refer to cases that are decided by the courts, and sometimes it's just confusing to people. Like, what are you talking about? 1984, we get this Chevron deference ruling that was all about, well, hey, if it's not clear what the laws are, let the regulatory bodies make the rules, clarify, if you will. The intention was that, but what did it grow into, Ryan?
Yeah, so in 1984, in the Chevron case, at issue was the interpretation of the Clean Air Act. And, if you step back a little bit historically to how judges used to decide cases, even in the administrative law context, there really wasn't deference. There would be respect shown to what the president and the executive branch said that they thought the law meant. But ultimately, as the founders had envisioned, and as the Constitution anticipates, judges were the ones who told us what the law was when there was a fight over meaning. In 1984, though, there was this this change at the EPA as to how the Clean Air Act was going to be understood. And there was a fight. It went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, when it comes to administrative law cases, fights with agencies, we're going to take a different approach. And instead of judges deciding on their own, again, as the Constitution anticipates, what the meaning of the law is, we're going to first ask if Congress has spoken directly to the issue at hand. And if there's no ambiguity in the law, then that ends the matter. But if there's ambiguity, or if there's silence, then the court is supposed to defer or basically accept the agency's understanding of the law, so long as it is a reasonable or permissible construction is the language. But basically, as long as it's not too crazy a view that the agency is trying to push. So there are obvious problems with that, and constitutional ones. This upsets really the separation of powers. and the check that the judiciary is supposed to have against the executive branch. Judges are supposed to be telling us what the law is, and not agencies.
Right.
The problem over the past 40 years that we had the Chevron deference is, even if you accept that as it was originally designed, the court kind of didn't anticipate it becoming, changing too much how the law develops. If you read the decision, they were kind of concerned about, the supposed expertise of agencies in complicated areas of the law, and they kind of wanted to respect that. The problem is agencies started, well, Congress, first of all, stopped writing clear laws, and left things sometimes intentionally ambiguous. And then you had agencies, even worse, trying to argue that there were intentional silences or intentional ambiguities where there really weren't any. And they were claiming power for themselves and creating new powers, and then saying that the court is supposed to defer to their interpretation of the law. And you can see how that sets up like terrible incentives and leads to the growth of the administrative state, because the agency keeps pushing crazy ideas about what it's allowed to do under the law. And then it says, well, it's ambiguous whether we have it or not. So court, you need to let me get my way. And you can see
where
the problems.
Out of control, right, Ryan? It's like you give them an inch, government, and they take a mile. We know that when we start to build and expand government, that it can get out of control. And I'm going to take this next logical step that tell me if I'm wrong, but a lot of these agencies are not elected positions. Many times they're appointed positions, and they're appointed. Some of them are there for careers, but others, maybe the heads of these agencies, are appointed by the executive branch. So now if we take that natural conclusion, it says, well, whoever is president has power to appoint in some of these agencies, and therefore their particular view of government or these regulations or their desire to have it go in a certain direction could really be controlled in large part by who they appoint. Isn't that effectively happening?
Oh, no, that's absolutely true. And in fact, there's a really notorious Supreme Court case called Brand X, which, hopefully is dead now. But that decision, the Supreme Court basically said, if a law is ambiguous, it doesn't matter what a court has said in the past, but that ambiguity gives an agency the freedom to switch back and forth between positions, even if those positions are incompatible. So you have things like what the FCC does with fairness doctrine, and Waters of the United States, which was a big deal a couple of years ago with the EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers. And depending on who is in the White House, the agency just switches its position, switches its interpretation of the law. The whole section of the law is thrown to disarray, and people are caught in the middle. But the courts have let that happen because of Chevron deference. It gets even worse, though. Your point about political appointees, one of the supposed theories justifying Chevron deference in the first place was that the president is politically accountable and people can hold him to task. Now, I think there's problems with that assumption, but some agencies, the president has even limited control. You think of places like the FTC, and they've been, in the past couple of years under the current commissioner, really been going to town, pushing crazy theories of what their authority is. And there's like even less accountability. And you really do have unelected bureaucrats going unchecked by the courts, and sometimes even by the president himself. He has limited control. And that's not what the founders envisioned for our constitutional order. The law is supposed to be written by Congress, because we elect those people.
Right. It's a big threat to the constitutional republic. This is not a democracy situation. This is a constitutional republic, meaning there's a balance. There are things in the Constitution we abide by. And I think you're right to some degree that maybe Congress, I'll just say, got a little bit lazy in some of these laws. Maybe they're vague on purpose because they don't want to take the political hit for that particular law. And in terms of detail, there's a way to hide behind that. It's a fascinating underlayer to DC that I think a lot of people go on with their lives not realizing it's there. Suddenly it crops up and you've been feeding this monster who suddenly has more control than you realize. Now it starts to affect lives. And I want to go to specifically the New Jersey fishing industry, because Ryan, what you were able to do in all of this is fighting for them, and you're going to tell the story here in a minute, what was happening to them, ended up overturning Chevron. So I'm going to go ahead and give you a major badge for saving our constitutional republic. I'm going to go ahead and give you that because
thank you.
Learning that you were so involved, so excited when we got this decision, because it gives us a little bit of oxygen to hold on to what we have. But I want you to tell the story of the New Jersey fishermen and how this all turned into something that the Supreme Court had to consider.
Yeah, of course. It's a really fascinating story. And I think, just to preface it all, I've spoken a lot about our fishermen over the years. And when I explain Chevron deference to people, it doesn't matter whether they're Republican, Democrat, conservative, progressive, liberal, when they hear the story of the fishermen and they hear this concrete example of how deference and Chevron, created such an unjust result, they immediately get it. Yeah. They understand what the problem is with the administrative state. Yeah. So it really is a good example of how everyday people are affected by the administrative state and deference. So I mentioned we had a case in New England a while ago, almost 10 years ago, that included that concerned the same sort of requirement that was at issue in New Jersey with the herring fishery. These are, we represent 3 companies. They're small business, family owned and operated. They've been fishing together for a couple of generations in Cape May, New Jersey. They fish for a couple of different things, but here what's relevant is they fish for herring. And after the agency got away with requiring, well, let me back up even further. The law that governs fisheries in domestic fishing allows the government to put a person on your boat, and that, so that person can watch you fish. This person is a representative of the government, but they don't work for the government. There are third-party companies that contract exclusively with the fishermen. They're approved by the government. So they're government agents, but they're not actually government employees, feds. They're inspectors, though. This person takes up a bunk. These boats are small, 5, 6 guys. They go out for a week, usually. You got to give up a spot. You got to feed the monitor. And they kind of get in the way sometimes, but the fishermen are okay with the fact that the law is very clear that the agency can require them to carry the monitor.
But why, Ryan? Why? What are they monitoring?
Well, they do. There are different types of monitors. In our case, at-sea monitors, they basically look at bycatch. So if you tell the government, because when you decide to fish, before you go out, you have to send a report to the government that says, I'm going out fishing and I'm going to fish for herring. Okay, well, as you bring in your nets and you pull in the herring, you may catch other types of fish. And the monitors are supposed to kind of examine to see what other types of fish you're catching. They look at, the biological samples, how big the fish are, all this sort of stuff, scientific data, and, also whether you're following the rules. Yeah. So, the people aren't happy about having to carry the monitor, but they do it because the law is clear. Well, what happened is the agency always paid for it. Mm-hmm. What happened is the agency decided they wanted to have more monitors on the boats, but they didn't have the money to pay for it. They had run out of the money that Congress had given them in their annual appropriations. So the agency, instead of saying, well, let's go to Congress and ask for more money, they said, we're going to simply create a regulation that requires that the fishermen pay the salary of the monitor. That way we get around the lack of funding on our end, and we'll just pass the cost on. Now, the problem is that the law doesn't say anything about the agency having the authority to do this. In fact, there are very few limited circumstances where Congress gave very explicit authority to charge industry for the monitors, but they didn't give a blanket authority. And in fact, Congress has repeatedly rejected bills that would create a blanket authority. So the agency was long frustrated with this, and they just said, we're just going to do it by fiat. We're just going to pass a regulation. The government's own estimates were that these requirements were going to cost over $700 a day, and that on average, you would see a 20% reduction in your return to owners, in your revenue, basically, over the course of a year.
$700 a day that the fishermen had to pay now.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Wow.
and 20% reduction in annual revenue. So, this was going to be a huge economic burden. A lot of people don't maybe realize fishing is it's like hunting, right?
Right.
You take your boat out, you may go out for 3-4 days, you may not catch anything, but
Right.
you still have to buy fuel, you have to
Right.
buy food, you have to, your guys probably usually get paid based on what they catch, so they may go home with nothing. The
Sure.
captain doesn't make anything, and the
Sure.
owner doesn't make anything. But
Sure.
who still gets paid?
The guy, the $700.
The monitor,
Right.
that you're required to carry,
Right.
that the law anticipates the agency is going to pay for. He still gets paid. And
Wow.
that's just unfair. I
Yeah.
mean, and I think people
That's
realize that.
killer.
Yeah. But the only reason why the agency felt comfortable passing this regulation was because of Chevron deference.
Sure.
Because they could go to a court and they could say, look, the law doesn't say we can't do this. It's silent. And
Right.
if it's silent, you're supposed to let our reading of the law win.
Right.
That's unfair. That's, I mean,
Yeah.
really, that's unconstitutional.
Yeah.
It violates the separation of powers and it violates due process. It's just unfair.
Wow. Wow. So this is ultimately, it's so interesting to me, because this is how our economy is so beautiful, in that when you allow for capitalism and people to build these companies and have a shot at it, and you don't burden them, it works. I mean, they're taking the risk. Forget the $700 guy. They're taking the risk, like you said, that may or may not work. But then we decide that we're going to put our thumb on the scale and say, well, what, for the purposes of environmental this or that, or to track this or that, or we don't trust you, so therefore we're going to do this to you. All of a sudden now we're starting to kill these small cottage industries that ultimately, that could be a whole nother show on how that impacts everything down the
Oh,
supply
sure.
chain, and people not really understanding like how that impacts their cost at the supermarket, at restaurants, whatever it is. So you guys took this to the courts,
Yeah.
and that's the Loper Bright case, correct?
Correct. Yep.
Okay. So you ultimately started at one court level and you made your entire way. What was that progress like, getting all the way up to the Supreme Court?
Yeah, sure. So again, this really is a David and Goliath story, because
I
we
love
have,
that.
some small scale family owned fishermen. A lot of fishermen, the agency gets away with these oppressive regulations because they can't afford lawyers, and
Of course.
they're very sophisticated. Fishermen know the law because you should see the books that, are this thick that they have to follow. But to go up against an agency over many years is tough. So we were really honored to be able to fight for them. We filed our lawsuit in D.C., which kind of has administrative law expertise, and the trial court, the district court judge, said he didn't think that the law was ambiguous at all. He actually didn't use Chevron, and he said the agency's allowed to do this for XYZ reasons. We went to the D.C. Circuit. And there, the two of the three judges said, actually, the law is ambiguous, and we're going to apply Chevron. We think this is a close call, but we think that it's okay for the agency to do this. And then we had a third judge, who's relatively new to the court, who wrote a dissent, and he said, actually, the trial court was right that this is unambiguous, but it's unambiguous against the agency, and that when a law is silent, you shouldn't, agency can't act without authority. So when that, we didn't file this lawsuit anticipating it to be about Chevron.
Wow.
This wasn't designed to take down Chevron. This was about overregulation and really saving the fishermen.
Yeah.
But when we saw that dissent, and basically the DC Circuit, the majority said, let the Supreme Court overrule Chevron. Our hands are tied. I mean, they invited this. They really did. And it was set up perfectly because we had such a strong dissent from Judge Walker saying the law, this is the exact case that shows why Chevron is wrong.
Yeah.
So we filed our petition with the Supreme Court. We hired Paul Clement, who to argue the case and to take lead at the Supreme Court. And he, of course, is a former Solicitor General of the United States under the Bush administration, and probably the best constitutional lawyer and best Supreme Court practitioner. And he, I think, in large part took the case because he saw that this was that David and Goliath story, and it really showed, the fisherman's story showed what was wrong with Chevron. And the court took our case, which was really amazing, very exciting. And now we got the result that we had hoped for. I mean, it was really even better than we had hoped for.
Definitely.
Yeah. I mean, Chevron is gone, deference is gone, and judges are supposed to just tell us what the law is, like they always used to do before 1984 and before the administrative state. And this, I think, more than anything, what's important here is that we have a restoration, or at least a step towards a restoration of effective checks and balances. That
Correct.
judges are going to be able to check agencies, and that there's been a signal given to Congress that Congress needs to step up too, and write clearer laws,
Yeah.
and because agencies are out of control.
Yep, absolutely. And I agree with you. This isn't a left or right issue. Ultimately, it impacts all of our lives. I guess the only person that may want this is someone who really believes in big government. Like there are those thoughts out there that the more government is good. It's ironic to me that in 1984, this is Reagan era, right? And Reagan is famous for wanting small government and not believing. What was his quote? Of the government says, I'm here to help. Those are the
Yeah.
scariest words. So it's sort of odd that during that time and that mindset that we would have this ruling, which has now been overturned. It's also interesting that the Supreme Court has a way of sort of righting wrongs. It sometimes takes them decades, and I think that speaks to the fact that people do their best. They think, and it takes a while for us to see that a decision was not good and look at the implications. And we're looking at herring fishermen. I mean, this is fascinating to me, but Ryan, I just want to applaud you and your organization. And it must have been so exciting to make it all the way to that. And then to have this overturned, not just for these New Jersey fishing families and organizations, but you effectively stopped the building of Goliath. I mean, let's see what it looks like now. But that alone has got to feel really good.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it's you go to law school, speaking just as a lawyer, you go to
Yeah.
law school and administrative law, everything is about Chevron. I mean, that's like the biggest, not everything, but that's like the biggest issue, the one that everybody likes to talk about. I mean, law professors,
Yeah.
yeah, it's funny when the decision came out, there's a famous liberal law professor who put on Twitter, on X, he was like, uh, I feel most sorry, and I don't think he was even trying to be funny. He's like, I feel most sorry for all the law professors now whose careers were built on Chevron, which just kind of shows you how out of touch,
Yeah. Yeah.
folks who were pushing Chevron deference really were.
Yeah.
Maybe he was being tongue in cheek,
Yeah.
but yeah, it's a big thing. I mean, I will say the fight isn't over yet for the fishermen.
Sure.
We've gotten rid of Chevron deference, and just the earlier this week, the mandate or the certification of the Supreme Court's opinion came down, and the D.C. Circuit has vacated its opinion. So
Right.
we're going to see what happens now. We'll be able to re-argue the legality of monitoring, and now without Chevron, which I think is going to be a big boost to our argument. And I mentioned the circuit thought that there was ambiguity. Well, it's hard for them now to backtrack from that and say that the law is clear in favor of the agency. So the effects will be interesting to see down the line. We'll have fisheries regulation is going to be really impacted.
Sure.
So all up and down the mid-Atlantic in New Jersey, fisheries, they're not going to be able to hopefully push crazy stuff that's beyond the text of the law. And other federal agencies too are going to have to be a lot more careful about the power that they claim, and the sort of regulations that they try to put on the American people.
That is a good thing, Ryan. That is definitely a good thing. And it goes to show you that sometimes in our country, we have a tendency to swing sometimes pretty far in one direction. But for some reason, the magic of America, we always seem to come back to balance and wake up. But in the meantime, there are jobs that are, in play, and families' ability to support themselves. So I know you still have a few hurdles to overcome with this, but it sounds like you've got the wind at your back now. So we wish the best for you. I
Thank
think
you.
it's fascinating, and it's pretty cool, Ryan, that you get to put sort of killing Chevron deference on your resume. Being part of that, I tip my hat to you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Awesome, Ryan. It's good to talk to you. Let's do another show when you guys get some more wins under your belt so we can continue to let people know what's going on out there. This gives a lot of hope to those who are looking for DC to get back in balance, which I think that's where we're headed. So this was a big part of that. So Ryan, thank you. And thanks to American for Prosperity, all the things that they do, we appreciate. And to my audience, guys, check out Americans for Prosperity, the foundation. Dig into this a little bit so that you understand, you can talk about why it's important, educate those around you. Ryan, thank you again.
Thank you.
All right, guys, we'll see you next week.